Hello, everyone. It's nice to have you all here. Thank you so much for signing up for this. Welcome to this workshop on podcasting development and technical production. This workshop is going to be run by the Medieval Academy of America's Graduate Student Committee and the podcast for the Global Middle Ages. So we're really excited to have you all here. And to hear from our excellent presenter, who I'll introduce in a couple of minutes, Hayley Bowman. She's from the University of Michigan. She's joining us our chair as well for the MAA GSC is John Correa. He's here with us, and I'm going to pass the floor over to him in just another minute or two. I'll wait though, as we kind of let people trickle in. So, keep looking at our faces. I'll just mention as we wait for people to trickle in a couple of things about this workshop. We're going to use the Q&A feature for Zoom. So you can see it at the bottom. You'll be able to submit your questions and I'll field them and we can coordinate them. I'll pass them along to Hayley. So feel free to ask anything and everything as they come to mind. It looks perfect. I've got an answer coming in. So it looks like we know how to use the Q&A feature, which is excellent. So our first question I'm going to answer live, and I will also type an answer, is on what the link in the chat is for. And that's a really good question. So throughout the workshop, I'm going to be updating the chat a couple of times with various links. The first link that is already in there, and I'll throw it in again for people who didn't see it when they came in, it's going to be to a document with a bunch of different links that we recommend or are offering. They'll come up in the workshop and Hayley will talk us through them, but they're various podcasting tools that you can use. So there's links to Audacity and other recording softwares, a couple of tutorials that might be helpful. None of these are affiliated with the MAA or the GSC, but they're tools that Hayley has found useful, some of us have found useful in our own work, and we just wanted to make those available to everyone as well. So I went ahead and I think I indicated that I answered that question live and shifted it into the answer. So thanks for the question, Rita. Let me know if that's unclear or anything. And again, feel free to keep submitting questions as they go. We'll hold most of them until the end, but just submit as needed. And if anything pops up that's really pressing, I can respond in chat as well. So I'll be monitoring that. All right. I see it's 10:02. So we've got a couple people still trickling in. I'm going to go ahead and I'll start updating the chat with the links as I start kind of talking us through, what you can expect today. So first, everybody, again, if you're just popping in, welcome to this workshop on podcasting and technical development. It's run by and hosted by and sponsored by all of those things, the Medieval Academy of America's Graduate Student Committee and the podcast for the Global Middle Ages, which we're working on as well. So I'm going to pass the floor over, since it's been a couple of minutes, to our chair, the chair for the MAA GSC, Jonathan Correa. He's going to talk to us for a couple of minutes just about the MAA, the GSC, and what to expect. And then I'll get us started on this workshop. So John, thanks for joining us.
Thank you. I will be brief because I am a poor opening act to Hayley probably, but yes, I am Jonathan and I am the chair of the GSC. And I just wanted to talk to everybody who didn't know what the GSC was, because this has had a wide diffusion done, about the GSC very briefly. Okay, so we're the Graduate Student Committee of the Medieval Academy of America, and it's a board composed of 6 members, and basically we do work to offer opportunities for professionalization for our worldwide community of medievalist graduate students and also early career scholars. And we have funding opportunities sometimes, and do all these services such as our newsletters, right? We send out our newsletters through the MAA listserv to keep you on, and we always have a topic. So if you want to pitch something to the newsletter or you think you have something to contribute that would be of interest to medievalist graduate students and early career scholars, do reach out to our colleague Logan here or to our colleague Rita O'Mara. I'll give you a link to the website so you can find us all very easily in a second. Also, we have a mentoring program that we run during the major medievalist conference cycle. We pair medievalist graduate students and early career scholars with more established scholars in the field, and also people working beyond the academy as well. So definitely look out through the MAA listserv for those when that call opens up. And lastly, we have a very strong presence in social media, Facebook and Twitter. So if you have anything, colleagues, that you want to like help us, would like us to help publicize or anything, do reach out. My colleague Kirsty Francis and me manage the social media, and yes, we are very happy to help. Okay, we are here for you, and we want to like make sure that you know we are here. Okay. Also, look for us at the programs for ICMS Kalamazoo, the International Congress of Medieval Studies at Kalamazoo, at the International Medievalist Congress in Leeds as well, and at the annual meeting of the MAA, because the GSC always sponsors panels, and they are often related to professionalization, right? Like, what can we do, okay, to help people gain more tools and be able to like produce the kind of work they want to produce out there, okay? And to that end, we have this podcasting workshop. We knew it was of interest. We know it's definitely urgent to start thinking about how we can create more public-facing content from the humanities, and it's definitely why we're here, why we requested and received the generous support of the Medieval Academy. And yeah, that's what we're here for. So I am going to like stop talking in a second. I will just lastly mention that this came up also as part of our new initiative, which we'll be launching next year, a new podcast series called the Multicultural Middle Ages. And definitely stay posted for that, because a lot of great things are coming, I think, and it's very exciting to see. And I waited with anticipation, okay, even though there's a lot of work in between. But yeah, I'll just drop the links on the chat to our Facebook, Twitter, and a tab on the Medieval Academy's website. And yeah, feel free to ask any questions related to the GSC, okay, or reach out to us individually, okay? Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much. And I already dropped the link in the chat to our MAA GSE webpage, so you can access that as well. I'm going to go ahead and pivot over to introducing our workshop leader for the day. This is Hayley Bowman. Hayley Bowman is joining us. She is a PhD candidate at the University of Michigan's Department of History. She is the liaison for the Eisenberg Institute of Historical Studies, and she is a host and seasoned producer of the University of Michigan's podcast Reverb Effect, which she'll be talking to us a little bit about that today. Broadly, she researches women, religion, and place and space in the early modern Spanish world, and she considers questions of gender, materiality, iconography, and theology in the pre-modern Atlantic. And I'm going to put a couple of links to Hayley's webpage and her podcast episode specifically, so you can listen to it if you'd like in the chat as well. So you can go ahead and access those. And I'll update periodically with these links through the chat too. So in today's workshop, Hayley will be discussing some of the best practices for organizing and embarking on podcast production. She's going to touch on how to navigate common obstacles in early production and episode development, tips for successful and entertaining episode construction, which anyone who listens to podcasts knows entertainment is pretty important, recommended technologies, and insights drawn from her own experience that we hope will be useful for people of all familiarities or unfamiliarities with podcast production. I count myself as someone pretty unfamiliar with this process, so I'm going to learn a lot from this. I will pass it over to Hayley, and like I said, and I see that someone asked a question as well, I will post a document with a bunch of the different links to the softwares and things that will be coming up in Hayley's presentation to just make it a little easier for you to hopefully access some of them afterwards. And I'll pop that in now and then a couple of times throughout. So thank you so much for joining us, Hayley. I'm going to pass it over to you. Thank you again, and take it away.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Logan, and thank you to the Medieval Academy of America for this opportunity to talk with you today. As Logan mentioned, I'm Hayley Bowman, and I'm delighted to be here today to talk about producing and developing historical podcasts. So as Logan kind of mentioned, in today's workshop, we're going to be focusing on what might be conceived of as like the first half of creating a podcast, which is production and technical development. I'm going to share my screen here. I've kind of put together a presentation, and then there will be a lot of time for Q&A afterwards. So feel free to put your questions in, and then I can address them, and we can address them at the end after I've kind of run through everything. So let me just get my screen shared. Can everyone see this? Looks good. Okay. Okay. So before we launch into maybe the nitty gritty of embarking on a podcasting project, I thought it might be helpful to share my background and experience in historical podcasting, kind of give you a sense of where I'm coming from. And where my background is here in podcasting in general. I'm currently a PhD candidate in the Department of History at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. And last academic year, I also served as the seasoned producer and host of my department's podcast, which is called Reverb Effect. And here's a little promotional photo for their website here on the side. But it is sort of a representation of how I look. Usually I'm not dressed this nicely when I'm editing podcasts. So Reverb Effect focuses on exploring how the past reverberates in the present. That's kind of the tagline for the podcast. It does so through the research of graduate students and faculty. Aimed at a curious general audience, the podcast seeks to draw connections between academics and the public, producing content that's not only historically grounded and well-researched, but also thought-provoking and engaging. And both of those elements, I think, are essential in producing a historical podcast. During my season of Reverb Effect, I produced episodes about topics from sodomy accusations in 16th century Germany to disappearances along the migrant trail in present-day Mexico. I also produced an episode based on my own research about women's visions of purgatory in the 17th century. Here you can see kind of a screen grab of the title and the tagline for my own episode, which Logan linked in the chat. The experience of creating a podcast episode based on really what was just a portion of my dissertation project was illuminating for me, revitalizing my project, and also leading me to reconsider how I was telling historical stories, not just in the form of a podcast, but also in my wider written work. And I think there's a lot that we can gain from thinking about our research in podcast form. Reverb Effect is a great example of a scripted podcast with interview elements. And I'm going to be talking about different types of podcasts that could be appropriate for historical podcasts. So this is just one of those types. This means that the majority of each episode is scripted. It undergoes a rigorous revision and editing process with our production team before being finalized and produced. Episodes are written by individuals called episode producers. So these are the students and faculty who are bringing their expertise to the episode. And they're the person that narrates the majority of the episode. My role as host was to introduce the episode and close the episode, with the rest of my labor being that behind the scenes work, helping to write the script and record, mix, and edit the episode audio. In my episode, again pictured here, I both hosted and narrated, so it's a good example of a historical podcast episode with a single narrator. And again, I'm going to kind of break down what that will look like. Most Reverb Effect episodes also include interviews with one or more additional experts. In my episode, that was Professor Nancy E. Van Dusen, who's one of the foremost experts in my field. These are unscripted conversations that are interspersed with the scripted narration. So I had already written up a script and I left space for parts where my conversation with Nancy Van Dusen would go in. And then I had the conversation and pulled out relevant elements and inserted them into my podcast. And hers is not the only additional voice you'll hear if you listen to my episode. During my time as seasoned producer, I also pioneered our very first voice acting program. So we solicited volunteer undergraduate voice actors from our theater and drama department to lend their voices to our episodes. This enabled us to take full advantage of the podcast medium to recreate what we might call historical soundscapes, with voice actors bringing the primary sources to life for our audience. In my episode, this includes recreating a vision of a soul of Spanish Queen Isabel de Bourbon emerging from the depths of purgatory to speak to a nun named Sol Maria de Jesus, interrupting her contemplative prayer by splitting open the floor and climbing out of it to talk to her. And I'm going to talk a little bit more again about how these kinds of elements that you can think about incorporating into your podcast episodes and how effective they can be. As you can probably tell from this brief example, There are a lot of different auditory elements, editorial processes, and organizational formats to consider when starting a podcasting project. And not every episode will be structured like an episode of Reverb Effect. I'm going to offer my best recommendations for embarking on a historical podcast, regardless of format or content, and offer some suggestions about the possibilities that await you in using this medium. So I thought it might be helpful to start with obstacles to podcasting, because I think this is kind of where most people feel most intimidated about embarking on this type of project. And so by identifying some obstacles, we can make sure to overcome them or even bypass them entirely before you even begin. In considering this, I came up with a list of 4 of the most common obstacles to podcasting, which include, I think, a lack of organization, having no defined audience, overreaching, or I also call this unfocused, and a poor recording environment. I'm going to tackle each of these one by one and kind of go through them with you to help make sure that we can kind of avoid them before they even start in most cases. So a lot of this, as you'll see, comes down to planning before we even kind of get into the recording process. Okay, so organization. So regardless of whatever format you decide to do for your historical podcast, you need to have a plan. This includes if you want a podcast that is more conversational and unscripted. You can do that kind of a podcast very effectively, but only if you have a plan and are organized at the outset. I think a good plan includes 2 basic parts. I've broken it down into a coherent progression of ideas and elements and an awareness of timing for each segment. So as you can see, this kind of plan requires thinking about the episode as a whole before you ever press the record button. I'm going to go into each of these basic parts now. So progression of ideas. So this is basically how will you tell your story? We're kind of trying to address that kind of question. This is where you need to be considering things like the background and context that you need to provide, what is a logical progression of ideas, and also terms and jargon that you might need to be defining for your audience. So in academia, we often use a lot of terms and jargon as kind of like shorthand or shortcuts, but I also think sometimes these kinds of terms also obscure actually defining anything really clearly and coherently. And you need to be able to do that in a podcast. And it's helpful to think beforehand about what might need to be defined. My main recommendation for this is, when in doubt, to show instead of tell. And I'm going to be saying this throughout the workshop today. But basically, we want to be able to take advantage of podcasting as a medium. So I kind of posed the question, how can a unique medium of a podcast enable you to tell your story in a new or unique way? How might you lower the barrier of entry to your topic to make it more accessible to a listener? Even if if you're thinking of your audience as even other people, other pre-modernists, there's still a barrier of entry to everything that we do. I might not understand something that someone in a related field is talking about if it's not my specialty. So I think if you consider things like lowering the barrier of entry, it helps you to better frame your topic and describe how you want to progress your ideas throughout the podcast. I do want to make a note that this is very important, that it's not a dumbing down. That's a comment that I get a lot with podcasting. Your audience is sophisticated. I'm going to talk more about the audience in a minute, but your audience can understand what you're doing. You just have to make it accessible for them. So it's definitely not dumbing something down. Instead, I think it's lowering a barrier of entry, and it's rethinking how you're framing what you're doing for a podcasting audience. And again, thinking about, this is not a conference paper, this is a podcast. So what are you doing that's different for it to be a podcast and taking advantage of that medium? Timing is also important. So this is answering the question, what is the ideal length of your entire story? Similar to something like a conference paper, you don't want to be going over in your podcasting. The more extra stuff that you record, the more difficult it is for the editing process. So I think having an idea of how long you want each segment to be can really save you a lot of time at the later stages and in stages that we're going to be talking about next time. So consider things like the attention span of the audience, the density of materials, and your ability to communicate ideas effectively. Again, showing often takes less time than telling. You'd be surprised how much you can actually communicate with just sounds or a few words. So for example, what sound effects could set the scene? Instead of telling me it's a dark and stormy night, why not play some sound effects of rain? That communicates all of that really effectively and quickly for your audience. So can you communicate with the sound rather than words? And I do recommend, even for something that's a more conversational kind of concept, to have literally maybe written down, a timeline for yourself. So after 8 minutes, we want to be talking about this topic and no longer talking about this topic. These things will help you kind of keep the story going and progressing what you're talking about. It will also save you a lot of time in the editing process. Of course, you don't have to do anything flawlessly, but the closer to that you can be, the less time you're going to be spending cutting and changing things later, which is definitely where the majority of the time goes in this process. Okay, so that's my organizational obstacle. The second obstacle is the audience, understanding the audience. So this is the question, how do I answer these questions that I've been raising in the last 2 slides? I think you can do that by understanding your audience. Who do you envision listening to this episode? I think it's important that you're not just defining your audience, but you're really trying to understand your audience. I make that distinction because I think it takes some putting yourself into the shoes of the person listening to really think about that. I think so. Something I often do when I talk about my audience, or I think envision my audience for a podcast, I envision a curious undergraduate student. I think that's something most of us can relate to if you've taught at all at the college level, even at the high school level. Someone who has bought in on some level, right? This is someone who has clicked on your episode. They're not playing podcasts in the grocery store to people who are not like deciding they want to listen to it, right? This is someone who has clicked on your episode because they're in some way interested, but maybe they have no background other than having a broad interest in your topic for some reason. Maybe they've also listened to another episode from the same series and they want to hear more. So someone who's curious, but otherwise maybe a non-expert. And the best way to kind of get at, understanding the audience is asking, what would that person need to know to get the most out of your episode? Again, this relates back to your progression of ideas. But I do find when I envision someone like that, then I'm able to kind of address these kind of organizational issues a little bit more quickly and easily. So think about if you haven't taught undergraduates, maybe think about a family member, a friend, a relative or a colleague, someone you're explaining something to that is invested in you in some way, but maybe has no background expertise. Okay, so what does the audience need? I think there are 2 main things that the audience needs in any podcast. The first is a host. This doesn't have to be a formalized host, but regardless of your podcast format, someone needs to take the lead. Someone needs to drive the action forward. It could be multiple someones. You just need to know who's in charge at what time for doing this. So in a group or interview setting, this ensures that the participants move on to each segment in a timely fashion. In a more narrative setting, this is probably the narrator in this case, but it's someone who is making sure that things are moving forward. The audience also needs signposting. So because you're relying on only like oral communication in a podcast, reminders are essential. So like, for example, when you're reading a paper, you always have the ability to kind of go back and remind yourself who is talking or what the subject is or what the topic is for that paragraph. In a podcast, the listener, well, they do not necessarily want to rewind to remember who is speaking. You may have introduced, 4 people at the very beginning of your podcast, and 40 minutes later, it might be difficult for the listener to remember which voice is which person and which person has which credentials and these kinds of things. So signposts can really help the listener track what you're saying. They don't have to be super formal or they don't have to interrupt the flow. You can very simply kind of drop them in. You can even do this later in the post-production phase, dropping in, as a reminder, you're listening to so-and-so professor of blah, blah, blah at this university, whatever. You can drop these kinds of indicators in for the audience, but I think they are essential in having someone follow what you're saying throughout an extended period of time. And sometimes podcasts can be quite long. So if you go back and listen to some of your favorite podcast episodes, they will be doing this. And it's almost not noticeable as you're listening until you're listening for it, but it does happen. And it helps people stay on track, especially when you have multiple voices. I think it's really, really essential. This kind of brings up basically a division that we've kind of been talking about, but I wanted to blatantly identify here. So this idea is the idea of how the podcast is formatted. So I think there are two different ways you can do this. There's a single narrator podcast, like kind of like Reverb Effect that I was talking about. And then there's also multi-person podcasts. So I think they have some advantages and disadvantages, and you have to kind of consider which you think will best suit your needs and purposes for what you want to do in your episode. So I've identified some advantages and obstacles, and then we're going to talk about how to overcome these obstacles for each format. Advantages of a single narrator podcast: there's an inherent host. You don't have to worry about who's hosting because you have the host already. That is you, the single narrator. It's also easier to record and edit because there's only one person involved. I'll talk about the recording process here at the end today, but definitely, having one person is easier than recording for multiple people. Some obstacles or things to consider. There is a need to incorporate additional voices for variety and emphasis. So nobody, no matter how lovely your voice is, no one wants to listen to you talk for 45 minutes straight. It's not entertaining and engaging. And you're going to have to listen to me today for a long time. But in a podcast, we want to avoid that because we want to have an entertaining engagement factor. Sustained performance can also be very difficult. And I'm going to talk about performance. It is a lot to perform for an extended amount of time in a way that's engaging. Also, maintaining an audience connection can be difficult when it's only one person. This is related to performance, but also if the audience isn't connecting with you, they're not connecting with you. So you're only one person. So that's something that can be difficult. And again, why it's essential to incorporate additional voices. For a multi-person podcast, advantage would be it inherently incorporates different perspectives and voices. It's more dynamic and engaging in that way, just from the outset. It's also, more engaging for audiences because of that. People like to listen to other people talking. Conversations can be really fun to listen to and engaging kind of just in and of themselves. Some obstacles would be requires very careful signposting to avoid confusion, right? So this is again where we're talking about you need to make sure that you're telling the audience what's going on throughout. Ideas can also become muddled. If you've got too many cooks in the kitchen, basically, if there's too many people throwing in opinions, you might lose track of the greater thread, which can be really difficult for a listener. Because remember, the listeners are not having the conversation with you and enjoying it in that way. They have to listen to your conversation. It can also be a challenge to record and edit. And this gets into another kind of problem that can happen, which is talking over each other. And I'm going to talk about ways to mitigate that. But if two people are talking at the same time, depending on how you recorded it, it can be impossible to edit that and make it sound good and make it sound cohesive too. So let's talk about how to kind of face some of these obstacles head on, and so we can avoid having problems with each of these types of podcasts. Okay, so some solutions. In a single narrator podcast, seek out and utilize additional voices. So I talked about voice actors before. I talked a little bit about interviews. I'm going to kind of go into how we can conduct interviews. Bringing in experts to discuss. There's a lot of ways you can do this. In my episode, for example, I brought in voice actors to not only read primary sources, but also portions of secondary sources that were really critical for my work. You could even, we've in the past been able to seek out the experts themselves and have them read parts of their own books. So you have the person's voice saying the thing from their book. It's really cool. So those are some things you can think about doing as you're incorporating the ideas and expertise of others. And voice actors are a wonderful way to do this. I don't think you need to necessarily, of course, if you know people in like a theater and drama department, they do a wonderful job. But you can have other people do that too. I've had friends do voice acting for me for different episodes. The main thing is getting a new voice in there to kind of indicate that you're doing something different. It's also a great way to bring primary sources, especially to life when we have only written sources, or even if you're using like a visual source, you could have someone describe the image or describe the sculpture or something like that to kind of signal to your audience that you're doing something different. Create variety and avoid monotony with music, sound effects, and segmentation. So a huge element of podcasting is these other elements that come into play, right? So it's not just someone talking straight for 45 minutes. There are pauses, there's music, there's transitions. You can break things up and kind of change things around so that the audience has a more dynamic experience. I also recommend taking time to perform and taking breaks. This doesn't mean you have to take really long breaks, but I think as you're recording, if you find yourself getting tired, it's okay to step back for a minute, take a drink of water, and just reset a little bit. It's amazing how it's almost like teaching. If you've ever taught, I feel like I get really excited and get going, and it can help to just kind of bring it down a second and kind of reset. And that will help you sustain your performance over the amount of time that you need to. For a multi-person podcast, I recommend designating a host to help organize your speakers. Again, it could be multiple hosts for different parts, especially if you have segments. I think segments are great in all podcast scenarios. So having someone to help move the action forward. Very easily way to signpost is to refer to each other by name. So my example is, Jimena made a very good point. Here is my point. You can do this in a way that's not really formal, but it can help remind the audience who was speaking and who is now speaking. This is a hard one, leaving space for one another and pausing before speaking to avoid talking over one another. This is difficult when you're having a conversation, but it makes all the difference in the world when you're editing a podcast. So if you're speaking with somebody and they make a good point and then it's your turn to talk, if you can just pause for a split second before you say what you're saying, it will really help so that the audio isn't like running and overlapping into each other. If that happens, it's okay. It does happen, but it's so much easier to edit if you're able to just pause for just that little brief moment. And I can talk about some other ways to avoid this, but leaving the space is essential if you can do it. It's also essential for each person to have their own microphone. And we're going to talk a little bit about hardware later. I've tried personally to do episodes where people shared a mic and it does not sound very good. So I recommend getting more than one mic, each person having their own mic. This is also a way that you can have people record their own tracks. That way there isn't this overlap of voices and you have clean tracks of each person speaking. And then you as the editor can change, the timing yourself and move things around. But their own mic is essential to get the best recording quality. It sounds strange. It just will, because they will be coming at the microphone from different angles, and it's very noticeable in the aftermath and the editing process. So yeah, okay. Our third obstacle, what makes a podcast episode effective? I think it's avoiding overreaching. Of course, you want to make sure you have enough content for the episode. In my experience, 100% of the time, there's too much content for the episode. I know as academics, we tend to do that, but I think it's just people overestimate how much time they will have and how that will play out, especially because you want to leave room for all of these amazing elements like sound effects and music and pauses and drama, right? These are essential. So you need to leave space for that. You also want to be talking at a slower pace than when you're talking, like even as I'm talking right now, because it's a podcast, you need to leave space for people to absorb. So avoiding overreaching will help fix all of those potential problems. Don't try to do too much. That's the basic thing here. I recommend, and this is something I use as a guideline, one or at most two takeaways for the episode, depending on your episode length. I kind of think of this to myself as similar to when I teach a class. So if you're teaching a class, you've got like 50 to 90 minutes to convey information to a group of people who are curious yet non-experts in whatever you're telling them about. Usually when I teach a class, I think to myself, if they can come away with like one thing that they can remember for the midterm, or maybe two, that would be great. That's a win. And I think that kind of goes the same for an episode like this. So this can help with things like cutting down on extra context that isn't necessary. So I have some questions, ask yourself, is this context necessary? Often as historians, we think, yes, it's incredibly necessary. You need to know about all this. For example, in my episode, I thought, well, of course they need to know all about the Council of Trent so they can understand enclosure, so that they can understand nuns. And I thought, you know what, actually, this isn't necessary. I can kind of allude to things, but I can't get bogged down in that because it's not actually moving the action forward. That's my second question. Does this move the action forward? If you're not moving on, you're maybe getting too bogged down in something. Did you already state that before? Do we need to state it again in this new way? Probably not. Is this contributing something significant, new, and productive to the audience? New doesn't mean it has to be like groundbreaking work for your field. I'm talking about new within the context of this episode. If it's not contributing something significant, new, and productive for the audience, it may not be necessary to have in your podcast. Just everything needs to be moving it forward. This is again where the show don't tell kind of comes into play. If you're telling me about something and then you're showing me in a scene that you've recreated and then you're telling me about it again, you're spending too much time on it. Maybe you should just show me in the scene and then transition into something else about why it's important. The other thing I think that's really helpful is that you can have other context that you think is important, but is maybe too big for your episode to be left as something to chew on. I think the best podcasts raise questions at the end for the audience to consider. So once they've become a little bit more of an expert because of your episode, they can think about these bigger questions and they can do their own research. And maybe you could provide a list of suggested readings for someone who really is curious, or maybe they'll go on Wikipedia and do some more research and that's enough for you. I think that's really cool. That's something that comes out of this kind of engagement. So I think raising these bigger questions of significance at the end can be really effective and keep your audience engaged beyond the 30 to 45 minute episode that you've created. And that's a great way to kind of bring these things in for yourself without having to feel like you have to give them all of this attention and time in a constrained, within the constraints of an episode. I think one way to help with these questions of, is this necessary? Am I overreaching? Am I unfocused? Is defining an anchor. So this is a word I just used to describe this. The anchor can be, for me, is a person, a place, a thing, an idea, a concept that is tying your entire episode together. So when I was thinking about my episode on visions of purgatory in the 17th century, it was based around a nun named Sor Maria de Jesus, who's the center of my dissertation. I considered lots of different anchors. I thought, well, Sor Maria could be my anchor. The vision of purgatory itself, that document, might be my anchor. Visions of purgatory more broadly could be my anchor. But all of those things those things would have led me in different directions, and I could have made an episode. I created my anchor to be purgatory itself. So everything in my episode ties to the idea of purgatory. This allowed me to dive into like literary depictions of purgatory, other visions of purgatory within this world, not just Sor Maria, but other people, women especially, and purgatory, women's relationships to these souls. and questions about religion, which is what I was really interested in. Gender and religion are the main things that I am concerned with. So this really allowed me to do that. I also got to do this interesting mapping kind of idea, right? If purgatory is a place, then how do you map it and understand it, which ties to ideas about space and place that I'm interested in. So I picked purgatory because it kind of fit those parameters, and it's also defined. So I'm not talking about limbo. I'm not talking about heaven. I'm not talking about hell. I'm talking about purgatory. And I found that to be really helpful, because as I found myself drifting into these other spaces and places and people, I was able to say, no, actually, I don't need to talk about that. I need to talk about purgatory. I need to make sure it's related to purgatory and it's furthering my story that I'm trying to tell about purgatory. It also helps if your anchor is, engaging in some way. I considered, purgatory has sort of like, it's something that people might relate to, people have heard about, these kinds of things. And that's something you can kind of consider. And I'll talk at the end about engagement, but that's something to think about. But yes, have your anchor and maybe write it down, and that will help. It will help you keep the parameters. Okay. So we're on to our last obstacle, which is the recording environment. I'm focused on recording a podcast at home because I don't think we all have access to a recording booth and studio. If you do have access to that, that's awesome. People there will be able to help you how to do that. I'm going to focus on how to record a podcast at home, because for my season of Reverb Effect, we had to record at home. It was during COVID, and I basically had to learn how to do all of that. So I'm here to share all of that knowledge with you. And I chose this photo of someone recording in their closet, not just because it's funny and humorous to think about. It's because I recorded every episode of Reverb Effect in my closet at home. And I'm going to talk more about why I did that. But yeah, that's basically what I looked like while I was doing this. Okay, so the first thing is a recording environment. Okay, so the number one rule for recording a podcast is having soft surroundings and small spaces. This means bedrooms, closets, even a blanket fort. I know people who create, like in this image, a blanket fort to do their recording. These are all good ways to basically reduce what is called reverb effect. So that is basically that sound where it sounds like you're talking in a large room and things are kind of bouncing off. It just sounds like someone's in a cavern, basically, in the recording. That's reverb effect. It's very hard to remove that in post-production. So I recommend you just eliminate it entirely by having soft surroundings. Experimentation is key here. So I experimented in several closets around my house and several rooms around my apartment. Things happen, and I recommend that you record and then listen. So for example, I thought I had found the perfect space for recording, and then I recorded a paragraph or so and listened to it, and I could hear birds chirping from outside in the background. Depending on how strenuous you are about all these kinds of background noises, it can be the best to just eliminate them entirely, so they're not distracting for your audience. And I thought, well, if I can hear birds, if a dog starts barking or a car drives by loudly, that will be picked up as well. So I changed my location. It's hard to tell until you listen. So I think you have to just experiment with it. Give yourself a day to try different setups and record and see what you think. When it comes down to doing the actual recording for your podcast episode, I recommend recording everything at one time. And I know this sounds like a lot of work, and it can be. The thing is, your voice will change from day to day, even if you keep the setup exactly the same. So for example, I had the setup in my closet. I recorded 40 minutes of my episode, and then I decided I had to go back and insert like a little signpost 3 or 4 days later. I had not moved my microphone. Everything was set up the same. I sat in there, I did it again, and it sounded like a totally different person. I played it for a friend and she was like, that I know they're both you, but it sounds like two people talking back to, because they're up against each other in the recording, and it's impossible for your voice just changes. It's all based on, I don't know, how you feel that day, how much water you've had to drink, all these different things. Sometimes things will change, like the AC might be on in one recording and the AC might be off in another recording. So for best results, I say record everything at one time. You can do multiple takes, and I do recommend that. So read, a paragraph, stop, read it again with different inflection, these kinds of things. But for best results, record at one time. That's not always possible, but you would be surprised at how different you sound from day to day. Okay, so that's the environment. Hardware. I recommend a USB microphone. That I think is the thing that will work the easiest for most people. There's all kinds of different microphones, and you can do a lot of research on them. USB seems the easiest for me, and I found with the people I've worked with. Pop filters, I would say, are essential. They reduce those plosives, right? It's not good to hear. It doesn't sound good on your ears when you've got those noises in the recording. They do have built-in pop filters in certain microphones. For example, the one pictured here is the Rode microphone. That's the one I have and I used. And it has a built-in pop filter. You can also buy the round ones that kind of can clip onto your microphone. Yeti is also a great brand that I would recommend. These two were recommended to me by the director of the Shapiro Design Lab here at Michigan, who they're experts in recording and podcasting. So this is all based on their recommendations, but these are the two types of microphones I've used with great success. Often these can be rented from libraries or universities. Public libraries often have them now because more people are getting into podcasting. You can also buy them for various price points. I would say like from $50 to $100 would be fine. I know that's not achievable for everybody. And I recognize that there's a financial kind of privilege here with saying you need a USB microphone. You could, in theory, do it on a phone and other recording devices. I would recommend with maybe headphones with a mic if you don't have access to one of these professional microphones. But I would recommend looking into renting for free. I mean, here at Michigan, it's free. It's like rented, but you don't have to pay anything. You just check them out like at a library. There's lots of kind of ways to access them. I also do recommend headphones when you're recording because it will allow you to hear yourself. A lot of these microphones, you can't hear yourself unless you have the headphones plugged in. It makes a huge difference. At first I was like, I don't know if I need that. I don't want to hear myself as I'm doing it. It makes a huge difference because you'll hear things like if you bump into the mic, if there's a strange noise, these kinds of things, you'll be aware of them and you can just say the sentence over again. Again, for an interview or podcast with two speakers, two microphones are a must. You need to have two or one for each person speaking. A way you could combat this with less equipment would be to do segments and have, each person speak about their parts. Maybe you have two microphones and then you give it to other people to use the two microphones. That could be a way to get around that. I would say you shouldn't be like moving the microphone around. That will probably also result in kind of a strange recording in that you would be changing the distance between them probably too much and a lot of noise would be happening to edit out. Okay, so that's hardware. Software. And these are just my recommendations based on my experience. There's lots of different things out there. I recommend Audacity for recording. There should be links in the document that Logan provided. This is just based on Audacity combined with my microphone for my voice sounded the warmest and best. Like a warmth in that it sounded more like a natural, like a person speaking and not like a robotic or cold kind of tone. It might be different for your voice and for your microphone, but I really thought that Audacity had the best recording for me. And that is a free program you can download. There's other options, Adobe Audition or built-in software. Computers a lot of times have built-in software for recording. Adobe Audition is not a free program. I know a lot of universities provide access to the Adobe suite. So if you do have that, then you can get that for free. You can record directly into Adobe. That's what this image is of Adobe Audition. And you can record directly into it. I just didn't attain the tone that I preferred using that. Recommended for editing and mixing. I did all my editing and mixing on Adobe Audition. However, if you do not have access to that, and it is expensive with the Adobe suite, there's other options that are free, including GarageBand and Soundtrap is new. It's from Spotify. I haven't mess around with it too much myself, but it is free to use. There's also other options. And basically what I recommend is looking for a multi-track editor. I think that's the key. Multi-track editing, like pictured here, as you can see, will allow you to layer your sounds. So in this example, I have a host recording, I have an interview, I have sound effects, and I have a music bed. In theory, I could play all of these at once. I could have someone on every track. You wouldn't probably want the host and the interview happening at the same time, but you can have sound effects, you can have music layered behind someone talking, you can have the host talking, fading into someone else talking. You can do all these things. And in order to do that, you have to have multi-track editing. So there are free versions. Anyone who has a Mac will have GarageBand, I believe, just on there, like automatically, or it's free to download. And like I said, Soundtrap is a new one. So you can look into those kinds of things. Adobe Audition was I can, if you have questions about that, I can help answer specifics about how to use that, but that's what I recommend. And then for interviews, especially remote interviews, I recommend Zencastr. Last time I checked, it was free because of COVID-19. Zencastr is a really cool program that basically allows you to conduct and record interviews with anyone remotely. And it's important because it records both of your tracks separately. So you're able to get a clean recording of each person talking, and there will be no talking over each other, even if you are talking over each other. Zencastr, so you could also use Zoom, for example, or any of these other kind of programs that we're using to do all this remote stuff. I recommend Zencastr because it does not have video. Now that can maybe make things more awkward because you can't see each other. However, it means that Zencastr is using all of its power to record audio, and the audio recording is higher quality. Even if you're using Zoom and you turn off video, it's not dedicating all of its ability to recording the audio. You can still get fine audio. I would just say Zencastr sounds like remarkably better in my experience. So I believe you get a certain amount of minutes for free right now through Zencastr, and that's what I would highly recommend for doing these types of interviews, or possibly even doing a multi-person episode if you're not in the same place, and that can allow you to have a conversational feel. And then you're able to edit it together however you'd like because of the multi-tracks, which it just sends to you after you're done. Okay, so that's my software recommendations, and I can talk more about this if there are questions. But I want to make sure I have time for the performance aspect. So this is something that I don't think people think about when they think about doing a podcast, and it's like essential, it's crucial, because you are doing a performance. You are performing. Even if you're having a conversation, you're performing your conversation. I encourage you to speak slowly and deliberately. Consider your energy. High energy performance is often the most kind of captivating performance. Obviously, everyone has a different style, and everyone has we're all different people. I'm not saying to be someone that you are not. I'm just saying, think about the way that you're speaking and how it will translate to your audience. This also means leaving space for editing. So when you're recording, it's okay to take a deep breath, to pause, to repeat yourself from the start of the sentence, thought, and idea. So if you're saying something and you mess up, you say something you didn't mean to say, or you use the wrong word, or you mispronounce something, that's okay. Pause, and then restart from the start of the sentence is my recommendation. It makes it so much easier when you're editing something, that you're not trying to splice a sentence together. When someone is having kind of this, they're trying to say something, and they stop and then they start again and they say it all really quickly. It's very difficult to edit out. So just pause for a second and then start over. That's fine. Similarly, if you suspect sound interference, so you bumped the mic, a dog is barking, there's street noise, just pause and re-record that section. It happens to me a lot because I gesture with my hands, even when I'm doing a podcast performance, and sometimes I bump into the microphone. You can't always catch them, but if you do catch it, just say it again, because it's like so difficult to remove those sounds, especially if it's in the middle of someone talking. What's the most difficult sound to remove is when someone is in the middle of saying something and there's something behind them making another noise and obscuring what they're saying. It's very difficult to remove these kinds of sounds. Again, with 2 or more speakers, do not talk over one another. This can happen a little bit, but it's very tiring to listen to as someone who's edited conversations. It strains the ears of someone not familiar and not participating in the conversation. So as much as you can, try not to do that. Okay. Final thoughts. I thought it would be a good idea today to end on this idea of engagement. So a lot of times when we're making a podcast, we're bringing something to a public present audience, right? The idea is we want the audience to feel as if something that's happening in the pre-modern world, in our case, right, is relevant and interesting and is connected to what's going on today. As pre-modernists, I do want to encourage, I want to say we don't have to, it's not like, I guess I just don't want you to feel lots of pressure to make every single part relevant. Our projects are inherently interesting, and that is good. People can just be interested because it's interesting. I don't think you have to make every aspect of what you're doing super relevant and connected to something going on in the present. I do think it's a good idea to think about connections. In my episode, for example, because I was talking about purgatory, I made some references to The Good Place, to Groundhog Day, to how people use purgatory in, just speaking in normal, it was like purgatory today. I was at the DMV or whatever. It took forever. I was just staying in liminal spaces, right? That's okay. It doesn't have to be bigger than that. It can be, and that's wonderful too. But I think that's the biggest obstacle I encountered when I was talking to people about pre-modern podcasting, is that a lot of people said, well, what I do isn't relevant, or what I do, people won't be interested in what I do. And I want to push back on that and say that's not true. We can connect as pre-modernists and as academics. And I think the good moments for bringing up these types of engagement, depending on what you're talking about, is in the introduction or the conclusion of your podcast. So it's okay if it's only appearing in those places, because you're trying to connect the audience at the beginning, and then you're gesturing to these wider, larger questions at the end. And I think that's okay. That makes the most intriguing podcast. And then the person can come away having learned something about a very specific time in history, for example, with these bigger implications coming out of that, right? So I guess I just wanted to make a note of that, because I do feel like people really undersell themselves, and you do have stories to tell, and you have important stories to tell that the audience will be enjoying and listening to. So don't undersell yourself. Think about why you came to this in the first place. It is interesting in some way, and you just need to communicate that and lower the barrier of entry for others so that they can also appreciate it like you do. Next time, I'm going to be talking about, so this was a lot today, I know. Next time I'm going to talk about my tips and recommendations for editing and mixing audio, regardless of what software you are using. I do have some tips about how to do that. Incorporating voiceovers, how to deal with questions of language and sources. So a lot of times we're using sources that are in different languages. And so I have some cool ideas about how you can convey that and incorporate that for an English listening audience, if that is your audience. Finding, using, and citing free music and sound effects. How do you find all of these wonderful elements that you want to incorporate into your podcast and use them legally? I have tips for that and recommendations. And then we can talk a little bit about permissions and ethics of interviewing and recording. This is something that I think a lot of us as pre-modernists are not familiar with, since most of our historical subjects are long dead, and we don't have to worry about these kinds of questions. But when you're talking to people who are currently alive and experts, I want to talk a little bit about these kinds of questions. So that will all be what I'll be talking about, that and probably more next time on December 6th from 2 to 4 p.m. So I hope you join me again for that. But for now, I think we're ready for any Q&A, and I'll stop sharing here if I can. I've lost my mic or my, thank you. Here we go. Okay. Yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you so much, Hayley. This was so informative. I've learned a lot, and I really want to start a podcast now, because now I need to do something with all this knowledge. We do have a couple questions that have rolled in throughout the session, so they're in our Q&A. I'll read them out loud, and we can just move through them in order. If you want to just answer them as you take it. People who have asked questions, if you have a follow-up question or anything, feel free to just, of course, submit and ask your follow-up, and we will certainly get to it. So Diana asks, what is and what do you mean by segmentation specifically in the context of as a solution to single narrator problems?
Good question. Yeah, I can clarify. So what I meant when I was talking about segmentation is also related to organization. Conceiving of your podcast as separated into different segments might be helpful in that you could say, well, this is my introduction, and then I might have a scene, a scene where I'm incorporating voice actors or something. That's another segment. And then another segment might be an expert. Even if you're not changing your narrator, so maybe it's not voice actors, but it's the introduction, and then you're talking about a specific moment in history that you need to provide context. Thinking about it as a segment can help, because that's where you could add a transitionary moment of music, or you could change the tone by putting a soundtrack underneath, for example. That creates sort of a new segment, you might say, in the podcast. So it's kind of just creating things, breaking things up a little bit with sound and pause and these other kinds of auditory cues that can help you. And I think as you're creating it as a single narrator, for me at least, thinking about what is the segment doing and how will I differentiate it from another part can be helpful in kind of creating a little bit more of a dynamic listening experience, even if you're only using one narrator.
All right. And I'm going to go ahead. I'm kind of quick typing up as your answers so that they're provided both verbally and typing. So if I miss anything, my apologies. All right, we have a question from Rita. We have two questions back to back. So the first question is how you might solve the 2 microphone requirement when it comes to remote interviews. And kind of as a corollary, she's asking whether you can combine Zencastr for audio with Zoom or FaceTime just for visual connection with the guests, what you'd recommend.
Good questions. Okay, so the 2 microphone requirement, I've actually found with Zencastr specifically, I got better recordings with someone just using like the like a head, like the earbud with the microphone like Logan has right now. I actually found that was better than someone having a professional microphone on Zencastr for whatever reason. So I actually think with something like Zencastr, I don't think you have to worry so much about having specialized equipment. You would have to experiment. And that's something I know it's kind of, especially if you're setting up something with someone you don't know, like an expert in the field who you've not really met before, you don't need to have specialized equipment, and that will be okay, in my experience. If you do know the person, you might do a test beforehand and have them try out different, mics they might have or different headphones they might have. You might find that using just their equipment is fine. I think when people are listening to interviews on podcasts, they also have an understanding that these are conducted, at least right now, especially over the internet. And so they are not as high quality as you would expect for 2 people in a studio together. There's also been a lot of understanding around, we have to record at home. These are not, in a professional setting anymore, and that's okay. So of course, if you do know the person or they're able to get access to a professional microphone, they could use that. But in my experience, it hasn't been an issue. And what was the other question?
The follow-up was whether you can combine Zencastr for audio with something for visual like Zoom or FaceTime.
That's a good question. Unfortunately, I think I would recommend against that only because, I guess it depends on your internet settings. I personally, despite paying Comcast a decent amount of money, I don't have a fast enough internet that could support both of those things to do them really well. And I think you really want all of your bandwidth to be going into this audio recording. However, if maybe you're using it somehow on your phone, you could potentially do that as long as it wasn't maybe taking away from the Wi-Fi. That would be my main concern, is making sure that all of your bandwidth is going to recording high quality audio. But I do understand the importance of kind of the visual connection. So in my experience, I did several interviews via Zencastr, and it was pretty natural once you kind of got going. You kind of were just having a conversation with somebody like on the phone. But I know in this day and age, of course, we like to see each other. So again, I would maybe experiment and just see if you can notice the difference in the quality. And if you can't, then you could use it. It's also maybe a tech issue. So, if your computer is newer, it might be able to accommodate those things more than other computers too.
All right, thanks. So Brian has a question. They ask, I've often noticed in podcasts that interviews done over cell phones have noticeably worse sound quality, which you've mentioned. Have you discovered any good solutions to this problem in your experience?
Yeah, they are worse. Zencastr is my biggest solution to that. We did do some, especially I think it's in the first episode of season 2, we had phone interviews. And I did my best, and I can make a note for next time to also kind of talk about how to edit that kind of those noises out. But it will definitely still sound like it's on a cell phone, and there's not a lot we can do. And I can, I'll focus on that a little bit next time when I talk about editing and sound editing, because I can show some examples of how to do these kinds of things via Adobe Audition and other sound editing software. But ultimately, having the highest quality initial recording is the best way to get the best sound. It's really hard to do a lot afterwards. So I recommend Zencastr if at all possible. I'm not sure if Zencastr can work on a phone. I know it works on like computers to computer, but they might have an app version too, which you could experiment with because their specialty is recording sound and it's not doing other things. That would be my recommendation.
All right. So we have a question from Reed. Reed says, thank you for a fantastic and informative workshop. What soft sound spaces would you recommend for multi-person podcast episodes? Because it's maybe a challenge to fit 3 people into a closet.
Yeah, that's true. Not all of us have walk-in closets that can accommodate 3 people. I would recommend thinking about a bedroom. Bedrooms tend to be our spaces with the most soft surroundings. If you're in a place with really high ceilings, you may have trouble. That's the only thing I would think. But I think a normal regular bedroom in like an apartment or home would be probably the best place to start. Maybe even a spare bedroom if it's smaller. You don't have to be sitting super close to each other, but in a place where there's not a lot of tile. If you've got, so for example, if you do have like a wood floor, I would maybe put like a blanket down. That could help a lot. Or a rug, if you have a rug, something to kind of, and you could even drape blankets over, like, I don't know, for example, in my spare bedroom, there's a big bookshelf. I could maybe drape a blanket over that behind me so that I have less reverb kind of coming off of that recording. And you can kind of experiment with that. You could surround yourself with soft things as much as possible. Of course, not everything is possible, but that would be a suggestion to do that.
All right. And surrounded by soft is honestly such a mood. So I appreciate that. All right. We have a question from Zoe. Zoe is asking how much have museums picked up on this new podcasting platform? And do you have any museum-based podcasts that you would recommend personally?
That is a really good question. I actually can't think of any museum-based podcasts off the top of my head. I don't know if any of anyone knows of any. You could submit them to the Q&A. I think they should be picking up on this. I could envision a really interesting series where a museum can feature different objects or images in their collection in a podcast series. I think that would be wonderful. I think there's a challenge that most people feel intimidated by, which would be translating something visual into something that you can listen to, or a material or things like that. But I think it's very possible. It just requires some narrative storytelling. So that's something I've talked a lot about with different producers, saying, I want to talk about this photo. I want to talk about this painting. I want to talk about this statue. And I say, yeah, no problem. Let's just describe it. How would you tell me about it? If I was on the phone with you and you were at the museum, how would you do that? So, but yeah, that's a great question. I don't have any great examples for you, but I think it could be a really dynamic part of a museum or an exhibit. And it could be something that could even be included for the experience of someone at a museum listening to something in the museum. I see a lot of potential for that, especially if you're talking about museum that could, that has audio files, right? So if you want to feature music that's from a collection, that's the perfect way to do it. We do have an episode, our very first episode of season 3, which I wrote and produced, but I didn't host, of Reverb Effect, is about a collection of recordings from a radio show, so called Music Time in Africa. So I would recommend that. That's kind of interesting and kind of along those same lines.
That's great. And there have been a lot of suggestions that have rolled into the Q&A. Most of them are pointing, and I'll copy and paste them under as like written responses. Most of them are recommending the British Museum's podcast, There's a History of the World in 100 Objects, which is a good example for material history. But again, I'll provide that as a written response as well. It's a good question, because I also, again, collecting podcast ideas.
Yeah.
All right, we have another question from Mark. So Mark, this is actually a point. Mark is pointing out that if you're working with headphones, they're crucial because the speaker audio won't leak into a microphone. So that's a point. We have a question from Will, who asks, when you were starting out, did you have any podcasts that you used as models or inspiration?
Yeah, this is a good question. I actually have, my answer is sort of maybe embarrassing, but I'm going to say it anyway. So I've listened to lots of different podcasts. But when I was deciding what my, like, I guess we would call it my podcast persona is, or who did I envision when I was saying things, I was really inspired by that podcast called Lore. And it's basically a podcast about like folklore and it's got a lot of history in it, which is why I was thinking about it, but I'm also interested in these kinds of things, right? And I believe his name is Aaron Mahnke, the host of Lore, and I really love the way he presented information and the way he was speaking. And so I just envisioned him when I was doing my recordings. And I think it just, he speaks very slowly. He's a great example of how to present information in a dramatic way where you're speaking slowly and it's easy to understand. All of his segments or his episodes are based on like history and research. So that was something that lent itself easily in my mind. But yeah, that's what what I thought about.
That's a great. And this is also, I was just going to take this moment to also plug Hayley's podcast episode, which again, I'll link into the chat, but it's a really good example. And really all of the Reverb Effect podcast episodes, I would recommend listening to if you're looking for examples of how to tell history in a podcast format. All right. Now we've got a question from Julio who says, thanks a lot. Now, do you recommend doing podcasts how would you recommend, or would you recommend doing podcasts in a language that isn't someone's first language or mother tongue? What would you say about that?
I think in this case, at least for me, if I envision, for example, doing a podcast in Spanish would be my reference point there. I would say a script could be your friend. If you're, I like scripted podcasts anyway, just for myself, because I'm a big talker, as you may have surmised, and I think I would get off the rails a little bit too much for my own preference. I think a script can be really helpful. I also think just keeping in mind that things don't have to be perfect ever. They also don't have to be perfect in every take that you're doing. So you can, if you can pause and reset and say something again or say something differently, and not putting so much pressure on, that every single part of the recording has to be perfect, because it doesn't. Even in the final result, it doesn't have to be that way. It's a podcast. A lot of our podcasts have and pauses and things into them because it is a person talking. So I would recommend, those would be kind of, I think, the things I would think about the most if I were trying to do a podcast in my second or third language. Yeah, and maybe having someone help you. You could run things by somebody first, or even have someone there. I will say it is helpful if you have a friend, even if you're doing a single narrator podcast, if you can have a friend with you who could say, hey, try saying that a different way, or like, I think you need more inflection on that question that you just asked. It's really helpful to have someone listening who's not you. And that could be really helpful in this kind of scenario also, because you could have someone to say, oh, can you, say that differently? Or, oh, like, what do you mean by that exactly? And can help with maybe a language obstacle, which I wouldn't necessarily even call an obstacle. Also, just being yourself is okay. So I think most people can understand that. I think I wouldn't worry too much. I get the anxiety, but I wouldn't worry. Yeah.
Awesome. All right, we have another question from Shirley. So Shirley asks, how would you incorporate or structure storytelling within one podcast episode as opposed to over maybe a season?
That's a good question. I think our reverb effect episodes are a great example, but I don't know if you have a background in English or literature and you've thought about like story arcs. I usually apply that idea to the podcast itself. So thinking about your narration as a story arc is really important. So I like to think, and that's where I have the anchor to kind of help, right, tie things together. But to think about, how you're building up to your main idea, and then, what kind of steps they need to take to go up the arc to get to your main idea. And then you're kind of posing your main argument or the main part of your story. What is the thing that you want the audience to remember and get out of your episode? And then you can kind of wrap it up and have some resolution and ask larger questions as you come kind of down the other end of the arc. And it's, I think of it really explicitly like I have an introduction. Now I'm kind of building. Now I'm going to get to my central thing I need to say about purgatory in my example. Then I can kind of lead away from that. And you can have smaller arcs that go along with this. So in my example, I have these narrated arcs of visions or things that people are experiencing, right? But they're used to kind of build to my central point, which happens, I would say, 3/4 of the way through the podcast. And then you have time to kind of wrap it up. And that's kind of a general answer, but I would say doing some reading about story arcing can really help. It helped me to think about, how do I want to structure this and how do I want to tell the story?
Right. That's awesome. Got that one typed up, I think, as well. Another question from Will, who says, so what is the production timeline like for a typical episode in your experience? How long do you usually expect them to take from start to publication?
It's a great question. So my answer is based on my experience with Reverb Effect, which was different in that I was helping another person to create their episode. So they would do, a person would come to me, a grad student would come to me and say, I want to do an episode. Here's the idea. They would have to write a pitch, give it to me. I'd work with them on the pitch. Then I would submit it to the editorial board, get feedback. Then they would start writing a script, which would take however long it took for them to put into it. So our scripts for, I believe our episodes are all around 30 minutes long. And the scripts for that are just under 4,000 words. That depended on how long. I mean, sometimes it took months and months and months. I was working, sometimes I worked on an episode for basically the entire academic year with somebody. Sometimes they could turn it around really quickly. When I wrote my own episode, because I had already done some of this work, I was already familiar with like how I wanted to do it. I would say it took me a couple of weeks to write the script and just get it how I wanted it. Once it was submitted and approved, which is something that wouldn't have to happen in every case, right? But for Reverb Effect, it's the way the process worked. It then took me, so once you have a script or you have the idea of what you want to do, it takes, I spent a day recording. I spent another day doing an interview. It took me maybe 3 hours to pick out parts of the interview that I definitely wanted to incorporate and decide where to put them into my script. And then I would say for what results in a 30-minute episode, it can take probably 6 to 8 hours to do the mixing and the editing of the audio. Yes. Well, actually just the editing. And then I would say it probably takes another 4 to 6 hours to do all of the mixing to perfection. So, and I'm going to talk about this next time, the kind of stages, but I went through and I would remove all the breaths, all of the weird mouth noises that people make when they talk, and all of that, get it cut the way I wanted it. Then you have to add things. You have to find music, you have to find sound effects, you have to add them in. All in all, I could get an episode from recorded to completed in like 2 to 3 days, not working like, 8-hour days on them, but dedicating the majority of my time to it. The majority of the time goes to like the editing process. And the most tedious part is removing all of the weird noises and cutting it together. That's why I'm saying the most you can do to like mitigate all of that in your recording process, the better, because you can really get bogged down. And I did get faster as I went. So I was definitely much faster by my 6th episode than I was in my 1st episode. But that's kind of a rough outline, I guess.
All right. And I think that one was numbers, which is never my strong suit. So I may have gotten a few of those numbers wrong, but I think I got that all typed up as well. All right. And we have a question from Peter. What do you feel is the optimal length for a single podcast? And could you also talk about ways that for promoting a podcast?
Okay, so optimal length for a podcast. I personally feel under 25 minutes is optimal. Doesn't have to be that way. A lot of podcasts I listen to are not. I just find, I think, and there's been some studies that once you get around the 30-minute mark, it kind of gets it into a podcast kind of enters into a new genre where certain people will not be interested in it. Now, some people want longer podcasts. So it's really, there's no like, I guess, right answer to this. I do think consistency within a series is important. So for example, the podcast I listen to, I prefer if I know, hey, I'm going to put on an episode of this, it'll take 20 minutes. I'm going to put on an episode of this, it'll take like 45 minutes. I think it's confusing if you're varying widely when one episode's 20 minutes and one episode is 45 minutes. I would say try to keep things relatively the same within a series. But I think that, I think you could have 45. I wouldn't go longer maybe than 45 minutes for a historical podcast, in my opinion. I think that can be a lot. If you're finding yourself, you need more time, I would say maybe you need to make a second episode. You need to constrain your episode a little bit more and figure out, what are you putting in too much? Because typically people are putting in too much historical context that is not necessary for something that's engaging and entertaining. But yeah, there've been some studies. You can do some Googling on this too. I did some at the beginning of my tenure as the season producer, and that was kind of what I found. And we did some surveying, and it seems around the 25-minute mark is kind of a change, and then around the 45-minute mark is kind of a change in terms of people's interest, whether positively or negatively. Some people again want longer podcasts.
Okay. All right. Again, I think I got that one mostly typed up as well. All right. We've got a question from Mark here who says, how important or not is it to have the same episode length for each in a series? So again, this is touching on something you were kind of explaining about, but if you might talk a little more.
Yeah, I think it is important for them to be relatively the same. I don't think they have to be exactly the same. If you look at my season of River Effect, it wasn't all exactly the same. I spent a lot of time trying to kind of rein people in terms of getting like a rough, because it's all scripted. I could do that. I could say, hey, you can't give me more than 4,000 words. Like, you just can't. The less words, the better too, because then we can have more time for music and sound effects and recreating these kinds of scenes. And I would cut things to make sure it was around the right general same length. I don't think it needs to be exact. I just think I wouldn't make it varied super wildly. You want people to kind of know what to expect, I would think, at least me personally, as a listener of podcasts as well.
All right, that makes sense. Now, I had a question, Hayley, as I was listening to you talk about this, one thing that really struck me is, and I think probably a lot of our listeners here have experienced teaching. I was wondering if you might talk about, for you in your experience, some of the similarities, but also differences between podcast creation and what I might think of as like lesson planning, because it seems very similar, especially for a lot of the podcasts we might be making, which is informative. How do you think of those as similar, but also completely different arts?
That's a really good question, because I definitely do. I do think about the similarities, and they help me kind of as I was framing, how I want to approach this. Mm-hmm. I think, of course, it's similar, and it helped me to think about teaching when I was thinking about like context and things like this, what and takeaways. What can I achieve in a short amount of time for an audience, mm-hmm. as I mentioned, right? I think that is very key, and that really helped me to have good expectations about like what I could actually do. What is doable? In terms of differences, though, I think there's a couple of things. One being, you obviously won't be getting the feedback like live feedback from your audience, right? So you don't have, that's why I think the idea of performance is really important, because you don't have someone, nodding at you or looking confused, and then you need to, change something or redirect or ask a question or have, the feedback from the audience asking a question. That is not there. And so you have to kind of anticipate that. And I think that's a really difficult thing to do. It helps to maybe have some, run things by someone else before you do it, kind of have that audience. But that's one part where I do, it's almost, I kind of miss the idea of having an audience while I was recording. Another difference is that an audience for a podcast won't have the background from like knowing you and having prior courses with you, right? So again, this kind of comes back to maybe things like jargon or shorthand. So a lot of times in my courses, there are themes that are underlying for an entire semester. And I'll say, oh, remember, this relates back to that thing. Like, I don't have to really tell you about the Reconquista because you already heard about that 3 weeks ago. And I'm just going to recall that for you and give you a touch point. And I don't have to like go into all of that. But I think with a podcast, you have to keep, again, it's like keeping it focused or not overreaching. And you have to do that strategically because you don't have that rapport with your students to kind of say, hey, remember that theme we've been tracing? How is this similar to like all those other people we just read like 3 or 4 weeks ago? I want you to make the connections here. You can't do that. So that's maybe another place where there is some difference. But the other thing that you can do, which I've never successfully been able to achieve in a classroom, is recreating an entire scene for the students. You can show a video, they can read a primary source about, say, a vision of purgatory, and you can maybe even set the scene with music or something in a classroom. But I think a podcast, you can really immerse somebody in the experience, in the scene, in the history, in a way that's really creative and fun and is maybe not as easily achievable in a classroom setting. Unless, for example, I'm hoping to use podcasts in the classroom more next time I teach. I haven't taught I was teaching in winter of 2020. So I haven't taught for a little while, but I was thinking about all these ways that I would love to incorporate more. I did some podcasting in the classroom, but even more so. And even, taking my episode or similar episodes where we're recreating a scene and using that in the classroom, because I think it will help students to think a lot about, how are historians presenting their work? How do we do that in writing in addition to doing that in a podcast? And what are the differences? So yeah, that's off the top of my head, kind of the ways I see the differences and similarities happening.
Thank you. That's really helpful and super interesting. We've got 2 questions lined up here. So one I see from John has a question, and then we've got one from Peter that we'll jump to after.
Mine is related to Logan's questions, and it has to do with the teaching side of things. And I guess you answered some of it when you said that you're going to incorporate it in when you teach again. I was wondering if you could speak to like kind of like the benefits you do of incorporating that, of assigning instead of like, let's read a chapter from this history book for a college textbook or something. Like, what's the value of having this different alternative forms of engagement, right? And keep them like, what value do you see for the undergrad in terms of absorbing the material and engaging with it? And also, I guess, do you think it would be worthwhile to kind of like structure assignments around this idea? Like have them like try and create a podcast for your final assignment instead of a research paper, right? Like, is there value to kind of like those alternative forms of engagement?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much, Jonathan, for that question. Along these lines, I'll talk about it a little bit here, but if you want to read more, I actually wrote a series, 2-column series for the American Historical Association on podcasting in the classroom, which I can get the links for. Maybe Logan could find it really quickly, where I talk a little bit about this exact thing. I think it's incredibly valuable. So something to keep in mind when you're podcasting in the classroom, accessibility wise, is to make sure that there are transcripts for all the podcasts you're assigning. Because podcasts should be providing transcripts. If they don't, there are transcription services, and I can provide some links to those next time too. I was going to talk about that a little bit in the next workshop. So that's just a statement about accessibility and making sure all the students can access the podcasts as they would have accessibility to your other materials in the class. But I do think that podcasting can be a really, really important tool for students to think with, not only in creating their listening to them not only listening to them in the classroom, for example, as part of an assignment, but also in creating their own, as you were mentioning. I think there's a lot of ways you can do this. And with an eye toward understanding, that not all students will have access to technology. So there are ways that you can do this where you don't even have to have students actually record something, but you can also have them think about it. So for example, an assignment that I've created for a syllabus that I haven't had the opportunity to teach yet, but I've created is to have students do a pitch for a podcast assignment and then write a script for a podcast for their final paper, for example. It's even more fun if you can have them record something, and they don't have to record it with all this fancy technology. They all, they have phones, they have computers, they have access usually at a university to something like that. And they can do some rudimentary, cutting. But I think the main idea is, right, how are they telling their story? It is like a term paper in some ways, and it is not like a term paper in other ways. And I think it really challenges them to communicate to a different type of audience, which I think is incredibly valuable, and something that I think we need to do more of in the classroom. I've experimented in the past with other kind of I call them creative assignments. They're also rigorous. I think sometimes that gets lost. It can be even more difficult to explain something via a podcast than in a academic paper. I've done similar ones where I've had them make like a travel guide, time traveler's travel guide, or like done these kinds of write, as if you are a person in the past, become a nun and like tell me about your day-to-day life, these kinds of things. And they have to cite their sources. They have to do these things. And you can do the same with a podcast. And but it can make them think about things like, how would I recreate a scene? How would I communicate with sound rather than just writing? Or how would I communicate something? What do I need to do? What kind of signposting do I need to do? This is things they have to do in their papers already, but it's doing it in a way that's, I think, a little bit more, it's more fun usually. And it's definitely more creative and with a different audience in mind. So if you say the audience is, a general audience, the public, how do you communicate to the public the things you're learning in this class? I think that is an incredibly valuable skill. So yeah, I would encourage you to think about, and yeah, it doesn't have to be something where they're actually recording, although those are great too. And I think that is a very worthwhile assignment. It would be just as much effort and research. It would demonstrate the same research skills and ability to communicate as a research paper would, in a way that's very different and interesting. But I think you can even do so without having them even hit the record button. They can think along these lines in smaller things. It could be something in class you say, at the end, okay, now write a pitch for today's class. How would you make today's class into a podcast episode? How would you start? Like, what's the hook? All those things would be really fun to do. And I'm excited about incorporating. Yeah.
Thank you so much. That was great.
I love all those ideas. I will also be incorporating some of them. So Peter's question is, talking about ways that you might promote a podcast.
Oh yes, sorry, I forgot. I forgot to answer that last time. Yeah, promotion, and something I can talk more about promotion next time as well. But promotion is something I worked on a lot on my season of Reverb Effect, because my season was only the second season, so we're still growing our audience at that point, right? And I really, my husband is in marketing, so I spoke to him about, how do we market this? What do we do? What do you do? How do I do this and make this? And I think something that's really key is, first of all, social media. For academics, especially Twitter is huge, right? As we all know, or we don't know, but you should know. If you're not on Twitter, you should look into it. Figuring out the hashtags that you need to use is really important. There's a lot of them. That's something I had to have, each segment producer tell me. I was like, I'm not an expert in your field. Figure out the hashtags that we need to use for your episode. I know some of them, but I don't know all of them. For example, for mine, hashtag nuntastic is used for anything about nuns. So I was able to do that, and I got a lot of traction from that. People interested in nuns were then, retweeting and sharing my episode. So think about that. think about putting together a press kit. So this is something I didn't really know about, but basically a press kit would be something you can send to interested parties, be it an archive where maybe you did some of the research that you're featuring in the episode. Other departments or people that might be interested in what you're doing. Other entities, so other podcasts. This is like, we didn't have a lot of success with something like this, but partnering with other podcasts would be something you could think about doing, where they could mention it, or they just mention it on their social media accounts. So the press kit includes the name of your episode, a link to your bio, or who you are as the producer, but also it would include a tweetable, like a tweetable description. So make sure it's the right amount of characters. It can fit in a tweet. It can fit in a tweet, including the link to your episode is all there. Images that you want to be used, and you should have an image that's a square. You should have an image that's like, what is it, like 16:9 aspect ratio or whatever, all of the, images that people can use easily in their social media to promote. You want to make it as easy as possible for someone to say, check out this podcast, here it is. So they don't have to listen to it and summarize it for you. You've already done that work for them. It includes the hashtags. It includes a link to the transcript. It includes these kinds of things. So I just, created that usually like on a Google Doc and linked it for people and sent it out. And we got a lot of, we would get, people through the university, people through different archives to then promote and retweet it, or put it on Facebook, or write about it in their newsletters. We got featured in some newsletters throughout like the university and places like that. Make it as easy as possible for someone to mention you. And eventually partnering with another podcast would be like a very cool thing. But even if you can't get a formal partnership, having them talk about you as they engage with their audience can help grow your audience.
That's really helpful advice. I wouldn't have even thought about really any of that. And again, a good plug for the next workshop, which I'll also link to. I've been linking to, and I'll continue to link to registration for that in the chat. This is a really good question and pretty germane to that point. We have a question. How do you actually get your podcast somewhere that people can listen to it? So how do you host it on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or something like that?
That's a good question. And one I don't actually have the answer to, because I produced and hosted, but I did not upload our podcasts. However, before next session, I can meet and speak with Gregory Parker. He's the director of here at Michigan, the Eisenberg Institute of Historical Studies. And he was the person who had all our accounts on all of those, on Stitcher, on Spotify, on Google Podcasts, on all of that. And I can ask him how he did that. He's very helpful and wonderful, awesome person. And so I will make a note to get that information so that I can help share that with everybody.
Awesome.
And do it accurately, yeah.
And in the interim, I've just also responded to that question with a link to quick, like how to get your podcast uploaded to Spotify. It's bythepodcasthost.com, which is a resource I've read through before and enjoyed. So you might check that out and see if there's some Google, but that's also something that we can go into in our post-production workshop, which will consider everything, from recording on out. And I see we've got another question. And that was, is there cost involved, which is a follow-up as well. Something else to think about. A lot of them are free. A lot of the hosting locations are free, but I'm sure some of them do require some pay. So we'll look into that. John, I see we've got a question from you as well.
Yes, sorry to jump in again, but yeah, I had a question, Hayley, if you had any, advice for people who might be interested in hosting an interview, but do not know the person they would be interviewing, like how to reach out to that person, how to make the connection and pitch the, oh, please be in my podcast kind of thing. Like, yeah. And also, is there a legal form that should be considered? I guess. So yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, really good question. So for example, I had never met Nancy Van Dusen, who very nicely agreed to speak with me in my podcast, and she was wonderful. It was like just fabulous to meet her and talk to her. So I had to do basically what you're suggesting, right? Just a cold email. What I did is I think it's really important when you're approaching someone, whether you know them well or not, for an email for an interview, is to try to be as transparent as possible. So I crafted what I attempted to make as short as possible without not overwhelming email, but to have a lot of information. So I basically introduced myself, introduced reverb effect, or introduced like the idea that I'm doing an episode for this, and I linked, to it. If there's something existing that's really helpful. If not, it's also okay. You can kind of explain and have relevant links, to things that are important in that aspect. And then at the time, I had already drafted up most of my script. And I think whether you're doing a script or not, if you have some type of outline or idea of what you're doing, I think it's really important to share that. And my script included, I had like in brackets, portion of interview here, question mark, or like, this is where I want to hear about, this topic. And I also sent her some questions. We deviated from our questions too, but I sent her a preliminary list of like 3 or 4 questions to get her thinking about the things that I, was hoping to ask her about, because this was something related to her, like a book that she wrote a few years ago. She's moved on to other projects. I'm saying, hey, this is the topic. And like, I thought, your book related to it in this way. And I would love to hear more about Ursula de Jesus and her visions of purgatory and women's visions in general. And like, I thought you would be a great expert on that. Right. And so I gave her some question ideas to get her thinking like where we might be going with our conversation, which then corresponded to places in the script. And I even had places where I had scripted out something and I put that in brackets and said, maybe this could be replaced by my expert, because it's basically stuff that was coming out of her book anyway. I'm talking about things that I am really getting from her, and I'm citing her there. And I thought, well, instead of that, she could just say it. And I think that got me my best response because I was very specific. And she said, I kind of asked her about it later, and she said she felt confident in that I had like a plan and she knew what she was getting into. And I also estimated, I said, I think this will take no longer than 30 minutes. And I tried to stay really true to that. I need 30 minutes of your time, because ultimately I needed 5 minutes of her. Like, and I said that too. I said, look, I've got about 5 minutes of space in this podcast. I'll cut it. I was trying to be honest with about, how much I would use, because I didn't want her to think, where's the rest of our conversation. And that was actually something that was encouraging, I think, from her perspective, from what she had said. It's not your podcast. This is my episode, but you're part of it and you're important to it. You're critical, but you're not hosting it, right? So the pressure is really off. She can just talk about something that she's interested in, and I can kind of put it together. I also reassured her that she would listen to it before it would go live, so she could have input if there was something she didn't want or she felt was misrepresented, that kind of thing. I provided the transcript as well, and I provided, the transcript of the interview and the transcript of the podcast to show where things were taken out. So I tried to just be really transparent. For that, we didn't need any type of anything like that. But that could be something, you don't need any kind of legal thing for them to sign to like be featured, as long as they're like giving you permission to feature them. So I have, her saying like, I consent to be recorded and for use in the podcast or whatever. So I think giving her that control was essential. So yeah, I guess that's pretty much the short of it, at least.
Thank you.
All
No,
right.
That was great.
And I was just going to say, I typed up as much as I could of that in the chat. So that one's not in the Q&A, but in the chat, just because it was asked verbally. All right. Do we have any more questions? Anyone have any questions you'd like to submit? Feel free to keep on. We've got another 15 minutes or so on our time slot. But also, we can feel free to wrap this, don't feel you have to submit a question, but if you've got any extras, I'd love to hear them. Hayley, I had a final, or not a final, but I think a follow-up question. I was wondering about, with your experiences with reverb effect and with working with your guests, and working, I think, you talked a little bit about the importance of thinking about this as performance and providing entertainment value. I was wondering how much work you did with your guest to prep them for the interview process, right? We think about ourselves when we are recording, all the prep we do to think about how to kind of make sure that your voice sounds interesting and engaging and all of these things. How did you kind of navigate that with your esteemed guest, especially because it's someone who's like such a decorated professor? How did you go about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I shared, and I'm gonna make these available for next time too. I have some guides, like recording guides that I created to share with people as I did reverb effect, which includes a little bit of a note about, be comfortable. I mostly just focus on making the guests as comfortable as possible, because I think that results in the most natural sounding thing, especially if you're only using an interview guest for a small portion. If you're using someone for a longer portion, it would be, I think, appropriate to just warn them that it can be tiring, and that they can, take a break. I would maybe structure in breaks if you're saying, my entire episode is going to be interview based. Have breaks, make sure that they can, get up and stretch and have some water, take a moment, because it is a lot. And typically in a conversation, people are pretty animated. I mean, they can be. If you feel it's lacking, that might be a time to suggest a small break or something too. I just think, focusing on their comfort and their comfort. So I think another thing to think about is when you're doing, especially with something like Zencastr where you can't see them, people will get more comfortable as you go. I find the best, it's the same as when you're recording something and performing it. Usually, after about 10 to 15 minutes, it sounds a lot more natural. If people warm up. So you could even have them, maybe you could revisit something you talked about later on too, and just say, that reminds me of something you said earlier. Can you talk more about that? And that could help get a more natural sounding recording of a topic that maybe at the beginning was a little bit stiff, or that kind of a thing. And I think a lot of that's mitigated again by providing some questions in advance and just making sure that, and you can chat before you start even recording, right? Chat a little bit, warm them up a little bit, let them know like they can stop at any, they have control. I think is really important. So I think that can result in the easiest and most natural sounding performances from your guests, without putting them too much on the spot and saying like you have to be an actor or something. You don't want them to feel too much pressure in that way.
That's fair. That makes a lot of sense. Thank you. All right, and it seems like no more questions have rolled in, besides one from Zoe, thanking you for this presentation and reminding all of us to look forward to part 2. Again, just a reminder, and thanks for this, Zoe, this is a good reminder for me as well. So part 2 is going to be held December 6th from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern time. I've been popping the link in the chat. I will one final time, I'll do this link dump, and just quickly, so just to run through the links that we've been making available. So you've got your podcasting resources, our webpage, the MAA GSC webpage, which has links to social media and to our newsletter, which I recommend because I coordinate that. Hayley's contact information, which can be found through her professional website, as well as a link to her episode of the episode she specifically recorded for her the season of Reverb Effect. That's a really good, just for models. And then again, finally at the bottom is the link to register for our December 6th workshop. So thank you again all so much for joining us. Thank you to Hayley, especially for this fantastic presentation. It's been wonderful learning from you. Thanks, John, for facilitating this and putting this together. And thanks to Chris Cole as well from the MAA, who's been behind the scenes making this all happen as well. Feel free to reach out with any questions. Our email, my own email information and John's as well through the MAA GSC website. Hayley's contact information, again, is available through her own website. I'm sure all of us would be more than welcome, and if not eager to receive questions and respond to them. So thank you so much, everyone. Have a great rest of your day. And reach out with questions. Look forward to seeing you on December 6th.